Should a buyer ever transfer that deposit directly to the vendor?
I will never recommend transferring the deposit to the vendor.
So have you ever had to tell a client, look, I'm sorry, but don't buy this one?
Yes, I mean, definitely, yeah. They don't get a building permit, and sometimes, there are actions against properties.
Is there any additional risks with buying off plan?
The first thing to check is that the developer, of course, is the owner of the land. But then there are two things that we consider really important.
What extra things should an investor be aware of if they're looking to buy a property to rent out?
Many changes in the regulation. Just to make it simple, we would say,
You found the perfect property, you've agreed a price. What happens next? How do you know the property's legal? What is your lawyer actually doing behind the scenes? I'm Keith from Target Property Spain. Welcome to another of our deep dive series. And today I'm joined by Javier Fernandez from Mael Abogados. And we're going to go through the entire buying process from start to finish. So if you're thinking about buying a property in Spain, if you've already bought one, or if you're just wondering what the process is all about, stay tuned because this video is going to be packed full of all the information you need to know. Javier, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
thanks for your invitation, Keith. It's my pleasure.
Maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your company and what you do.
Yeah, so, well, as you said, my name is Javier Fernandez. I've been working as a real estate lawyer for 13 years here in Costa del Sol. So I have experience working in big law firms here in the area with international profile, dealing with international clients. And my company is set in Fuengirola, and basically we are focused on non-resident clients investing property in Spain.
Why is it important for a buyer to have an independent lawyer as opposed to one maybe recommended by the developer or in-house with an estate agent?
Well, basically to defend the interests of the buyer and to check things properly, especially considering that the town planning situation in Costa del Sol is difficult to understand for a non-resident investor.
Yeah.
Understanding that each municipality has different regulations, and therefore there are many things to check, especially a situation with licenses, land registry. And the figure of an independent lawyer is a way to give security to the international client and to make a safe investment and to proceed in a straightforward process with all the security and all the legal guarantees.
So let's start with something I hear a lot. A lot of people think buying a property in Spain is exactly the same as buying a property in their home country. True or false?
False. I mean, each country has different regulations, and therefore understanding the legalities in the country where you're making this investment is quite important. We have a safe system where we have many guarantees in the process. We have the lawyer, we have the notary, we have the land registry. But of course, we need some guidance when you buy a property, and therefore the figure of a lawyer is quite important. Of a Spanish lawyer with a proper understanding of the system, here, it's essential for a safe investment.
Yeah, we always say to buyers, you should surround yourselves with a good team. Exactly. So, a good agent, a good finance guy if you need finance, and a good lawyer.
Exactly.
So at what stage in the process should a buyer start talking to a lawyer?
Basically, when they close the deal, when you get into an agreement, you make the offer, and the offer is accepted by the vendor. That's the time when you normally, guys, you draw up the reservation document, and there is a legal document where we set the main conditions of the transaction, purchase price, information about the parties, an estimated date for the signing of the contract and completion. And that's the first point where the lawyer is important, so that we make sure that we are including all the necessary conditions for the transaction.
At that stage, what sort of documents do they need to have in place?
So basically, when we represent an international client, we focus on getting all the information from the land registry, which is the authority that is including all the necessary charges of the property, and also details about the ownership of the property. We also get information about licenses, town planning situation, especially what the LPO, that is the first occupational license here,
which we hear a lot about.
Of course, it's a very popular document when we do the due diligence, and any information about the services of the property, utilities, community, and anything that it's part of the transaction, but mainly checking the situation with the title deed as well, where we can see a proper description of the property.
So these documents are provided from the vendor's side, from the seller's side. Are there any documents the buyer needs before they can buy a property?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to understand their financial situation and to know if they are getting a mortgage or if they are cash buyers.
Yep.
So the qualification of the client is sometimes really important for a quick and successful transaction. Is not the same with your cash buyer, where we normally focus on getting power of attorney to represent the client, applying for the NIE. And when you get a mortgage, of course, you have to qualify the client previously, so that we understand that we can get the pre-approval before we make any payment, so that we make sure that we don't find any roadblocks through the process.
And just a quick one, if you like this sort of content, please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and of course, ring the notification bell, and you'll get an update each and every time we release new content. Let's get back to the interview. So you mentioned the NIE, which is something that probably foreign buyers are unaware of. What exactly is the NIE?
The NIE number is a tax number, similar to the national insurance number that you have in the UK. And it's only a number is called number of identification number for foreigners, but technically it's only a number that we use for to pay taxes and to do anything in Spain with legal implications. Yeah.
So to buy a car,
buy a
property, buy a business.
Exactly. Anything that you do when you buy something, you want to get an invoice, you need the NI number. But it's important to say that there are no, it has no immigration implications. So getting the NI number is only getting a tax number, but not getting any rights. So
related to an identification number.
It is indeed, exactly. That's it.
Anything else? I mean, do they need a Spanish bank account? Is that important?
Yeah, the Spanish bank account is part of the process. Yeah, so we normally recommend all the clients to sign power of attorney, where we do include all the necessary authorities to represent them during the process, which basically includes the authority to apply, as you said, for the NI number. Also the authority to open the Spanish bank account is the one that we use to set direct debits for all the running costs of the property. So we say the council taxes, community fees, water, electricity, or any other service. Technically, the Spanish bank account is not essential for European citizens, but we normally recommend to open the account because many companies, they are not adapted to the SEPA system, and sometimes we find roadblocks. So ideally, opening an account is a recommendable step, so that you can set all the direct debits after completion.
Yeah, I mean, it's agreed. The Spanish banks are certainly less than perfect.
Exactly.
But there's some that are certainly better to use than others as a non-resident. Exactly. And I guess at this stage, buyers should be thinking about how they want to own the property. So do they want to own it in their own name, in joint names, or maybe through a company? Could you? What are the pros and cons of each?
Well, the standard situation where you buy a holiday home and you are not planning to buy more properties is that you buy in your sole name or together with your spouse, I mean, in joint names. That's the ideal situation, because buying in the name of a company, unless there is a specific, reason, because they use a foreign company and they have any tax benefit, normally it's not recommended. And in some cases, we use a Spanish company where they are planning to have a proper activity in Spain. Like buying a few properties, renting, or doing buying and selling in a short time frame. But normally the standard situation for a client that is coming to Costa del Sol for the first time is buying as an individual.
So unless you're looking at it as a business enterprise or buying several properties, you should be looking at buying it in your own name or joint names with your partner.
Definitely. That would be the recommendable option.
Okay, so somebody finds a place. They agree a price with the vendor. What happens next?
Well, the next step will be the signing of the reservation document. As we said, it's a very simple document that normally agencies, they draw up, where we include, as we say, name of the parties, price of the property. We include any special conditions. Sometimes we say that if the furniture is included, or there is subject to any technical inspection. And also we include the estimated date for the signing of the private purchase contract and the date for completion. It's the signing of the reservation document comes together with the payment of a deposit. The deposit normally amounts to 6,000 euros. There is the necessary amount to take the property off the market and to start the process and carry out the due diligence.
And how safe is that deposit?
Well, the deposit normally is held by the lawyer. There's a lawyer that's recommendable option, so that we can check things properly and make sure that the property is legally fine before we make any payment. In some cases here in Costa del Sol, agencies are also holding the deposit, but basically what we do is that the deposit is kept by any of the parties, agency or lawyer, as a way to make sure that we carry out the due diligence before we pay the 10%. That is the second step of the process.
Should a buyer ever transfer that deposit directly to the vendor?
I will never recommend transferring the deposit to the vendor because, of course, you lose control of the situation. And that's the reason why we always recommend the deposits held by the lawyer into the escrow account.
Okay, so reservation documents signed, deposits paid, properties off the market at that stage. What sort of checks begin at that stage?
All right. The next step is that we get in touch with the vendor's lawyer. We are representing the buyer. We collect the property paperwork. So basically, we focus on getting copy of the title deed. We check the situation in the land registry. We get what we call in Spanish the nota simple.
And that's how you check that the seller actually owns the property.
That's the real owner of the property. We check the shares, the percentage he owns the property in case there is a joint ownership. And we also see if there is any charge, like could be a mortgage, could be an embargo, or anything that is affecting the property.
So all of that is shown on this document, the nota simple.
The nota simple, exactly.
Which is like an abridged version of the escritura, I guess.
Exactly.
Shows the basic information.
It's the registration. The next step after the escritura, it's the authority. The land registry is the authority that we use here to inform anyone about the ownership of the property.
And what are the most common issues you find?
Well, talking about land registry, it's very normal that we could find embargoes. People that they have debts with the municipality, with the tax office, and situation where we have to remove these debts before we complete. And then the main thing to consider is the town planning situation. It's very standard here in the area that we find inland properties that could be in rustic lands, where we have to check any specific protection on the land and the specific action from the municipality. And then also applicable to properties on the Costa del Sol. I would say if we go to Marbella or any other areas, checking the licenses it's important so that they are not null and void, and we know that everything is in place for a safe investment.
So have you ever had to tell a client, look, I'm sorry, but don't buy this one?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's not something very standard. It happens here because in some cases people they do works in the properties. They don't get a license, a building permit, and sometimes there are actions against properties. It is pretty standard that we apply for a non-infraction certificate, and not the first time that we find that there is an action from the municipality against the property.
So a non-infraction certificate that shows whether there's any actions against the property.
Exactly.
Okay.
Normally, the key document is the LPO, as we said before, the first license. But understand that it's technically possible that you get a license on the existing construction, but then you extend the property with no license.
Yeah.
And therefore, there is an infraction against the property because you carry out the works without any specific permit. So that's why
you've extended illegally.
Exactly. So that's the key, especially when buying villas, where we know that's typical Spanish. We extend, we don't want to declare, and we don't want to pay taxes, and therefore there is always a risk that an action could be taken against the property.
Okay, great. So that's in terms of second-hand properties. Yeah. Let's talk off-plan, because on paper, off-plan looks like a great opportunity. Is there any additional risks with buying off-plan?
So basically, when you buy a property from a developer, that you're buying a future property, so you only know about the existence of the plot, but not about the individual property you're buying. The first thing to check is that the developer, of course, is the owner of the land. Second, that there is a building permit, so they have the authorization from the municipality to carry out the project. But then there are two things that we consider really important, and one of them is that they have in place what we call cuenta especial, that is kind of escrow account, where we know that the monies that you pay during the process, they will be only used for the construction of the property. And then bank guarantees, because when you buy often, there are two, according to the building law in Spain, there are two options for developers. The standard one is they get a bank guarantee. That is the document provided by a national bank entity that covers any amounts that you pay during the process. But it's true that there is a second option that we also find with many developers, and that is getting an insurance policy with a company that is duly registered in the Spanish system, that is also the way to secure the money during the process.
What happens if things things always get delayed.
Yeah.
But what happens when things get delayed or maybe things go wrong and the property doesn't get completed?
Well, that's the reason why we have the bank guarantees of the insurance policy. There is the necessary document, the one that we can execute if something goes wrong. Something goes wrong means that the developer, they could go bankrupt. Yeah, or if they don't finish the construction. Yeah, so that's the way to give some higher level of security to the client, because we know that we can execute the bank guarantee and get the money back.
There's a lot more security to buying off plan nowadays compared to how it used to be back in the days of the Wild West.
Of course, because now it's really difficult that we find a developer that is not providing the necessary guarantees.
Yeah,
and therefore, I mean, we will always advise against buying a property from a developer that is not providing cuenta especial, the escrow account, or any bank guarantee or insurance policy.
Because we all remember what happened pre-recession.
Yeah, exactly. Years
bust.
ago, I mean, many developers, they were, selling properties with no guarantees. And we know about, the situation that we had here.
So you mentioned earlier the Contrato de Arras.
Yeah.
And I apologize for my Spanish accent.
No, it's okay.
So you mentioned the Contrato de Arras, or as we call it, the private purchase contract.
Exactly.
Now, that's the stage where things start to feel serious. Yeah. What exactly is the Contrato de Arras?
The Contrato de Arras is a private purchase contract, which is the main document that we sign during the process, because it's when the buyer will pay the 10% of the price. Yeah, so this is a very serious commitment for both parties, and it's the document we set in detail all the conditions of the transaction. As we said before, the reservation document is a simple document, legally speaking, so that we take the property off the market. But after the due diligence, we draw up this PPC, this private purchase contract, or Contrato de Arras, where we said in detail description of the property. And the most important thing, apart from the special conditions, special agreements, are the legal consequences for the parties. And possibly we can explain a little bit what happens in Spain. Yeah. So basically, from the buyer's side, if you change your mind, of course, when you pay the 10%, you lose the 10%.
So on the signing of Contrato de Arras, that the buyers increase their deposit from that 6,000 up to the value of 10%.
10%.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, if they change their mind, they lose the 10%.
Okay.
And the reason why we call it Contrato de Arras is because according to the civil law, there is a possibility for the vendor, to terminate the contract, paying double of the amounts to the buyer. So from the other side, if the vendor pulls out, they have to pay double of the amounts.
So if the vendor pulls out or can't complete, the buyer gets their 10% back, and the same again, the compensation. So in the UK, we have something called gazumping, which is where a sale is agreed, the vendor gets a better offer from a third party, and that buyer is rejected and the whole deal collapses. I guess once you've signed 10% in Spain, once you've signed Contrato de Arras, that doesn't really happen.
Could happen, but I mean,
it has to be a very good
practice. In the practice,
very good offer.
Yeah, the number of cases that we found are very low. Why? Because the money that you risk is really high. Yeah, so I don't think that, I mean, vendors, they don't want to risk double of the amounts. Yeah, and so normally the signing of the PPC is 90% of the success of the transaction, because it's normally when we are setting all the conditions and agreements, and everything should be okay.
Yeah, I can say in all the years I've been doing this, I can probably count on one hand the amount of times we've gone to 10% and the sale hasn't happened.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about power of attorney, because it's a term a lot of buyers hear about. What does it mean in real life?
Well, in real life, it's a formal authorization given by the buyer or the vendor to the lawyer, giving power to deal with the transaction on their behalf. Yeah. In Spain, it's important to explain that the notary public is a very, very important figure of the legal system. So any document that we sign, any part of the document has to be signed in front of the notary, and the power of attorney as well. So normally what we do is that if the client is here on the ground locally, we go to the notary in Spain and we sign the document. If the client is in the UK, for instance, we draw up the document in both Spanish and English, and we give instructions to the client to sign there with a corresponding apostille.
Of course, because you speak many languages, don't you?
I do. Yeah. So
I'm jealous.
So we can do it in any language. I mean, we can do Spanish, English, Spanish, German, Spanish, French. But basically, the power of attorney is the document where we get authorization from the client to act on from his behalf, and where we include the standard authorities for a real estate transaction. So when we say standard authorities, we say that we can buy and sell, that we can get finance if we need a mortgage, especially considering the specific circumstances of getting a mortgage here and all the bureaucracy that we have. Then also representing the client in front of the Spanish public authorities. It would be the tax office, the municipality, and the renal authorities. And doing the utilities for the clients, I mean the water, electricity, and setting direct debits, opening the bank account.
Internet, don't forget internet.
Yeah, as well, everything.
Very important.
We do everything. We include all these specific authorities that we need so that we make sure that we're in control of the process. Of course, always following the instructions from the client and understanding that we will always proceed as per the...
So you don't just get power of attorney then act, you always take instructions?
No, we always take instructions from the client, and we get a previous confirmation so that they know that we're doing a proper use of the power of attorney.
And does it always make the whole process quicker and easier?
Definitely, because the main thing that sometimes now in the situation that we have now is that delays the process is applying for the NIE number. That we know that getting appointments is difficult, and so we normally try to get power of attorney at the beginning of the process, basically because we can start applying for the NIE number. That sometimes takes a few weeks to get the appointment here in Malaga, and also because we make sure that we don't need the personal attendance of the client. So if the client is in the UK or anywhere in the world, we know that we can get authorization and with the power of attorney signed on the behalf.
That's a good point about the wait for the NIE, because we have found, I'm sure you have as well, now with ChatGPT and all the AI engines, a lot of buyers do their research and come armed with what they think is the process. Oh, go and get yourself an NIE number, turn up at the police station, and then find out there's maybe a 3 or 4 week wait for the NIE number.
It's not a question of queuing up in the morning like it used to be a few years ago. Now everything is online, so getting appointments sometimes is difficult, and sometimes you find appointments in Marbella or in Fuengirola or in Malaga, so you have to be a little bit flexible so that you get the NIE number in a reasonable time. That is essential for a quick transaction sometimes. That's the main thing, especially for cash buyers, but also for clients getting finance and mortgages, because banks, they request the NIE number to formalize the transaction and to produce the fee and the binding offer and all the necessary documents.
Okay, and we know banks are always quick and ask for everything in one go, don't they? No, not at all.
Not really.
Okay, so let's talk costs, okay, because it's a question we get an awful lot from buyers. So buying a second-hand, a resale property, what extra costs should buyers be allowing for?
On top of the price, we should consider the transfer tax. That is 7%. Is a fixed rate now. 1% roughly is the notary and the registration fee. We say roughly because we never know in advance. In Spain, we have a system where it depends on the annexes and number of pages that we have together with the title deed. And 1% plus VAT are the standard legal fees. And so we normally say 9% on top of the price to cover all the expenses for a cash buyer. If you're getting a mortgage, of course, we should consider, the mortgage expenses, fees, and anything like the setup fee for the mortgage, valuation, and anything that depends on the specific offer given by the bank.
What would you say are the most commonly overlooked costs that buyers don't actually think about, and it's a bit of a surprise when it comes along at the end?
Hidden costs we don't have technically. When we say 9%, we can tell the client for sure that 9% will cover everything. So normally hidden costs we find where we have finance, for instance, things that we cannot consider initially. But normally the process here is clear, and we don't have hidden costs because we do include everything in the services, so that we apply for the NIE number. So technically, we should not consider any hidden costs if you get the right information.
Great. So there's no extra cost for the NIE number. There's no extra cost to set up utilities. It's all included.
All included, and normally, we pay a government fee. When we get the NIE number, it's a very low amount. It's like 10 euros.
What about off-plan properties or new build properties? What are the costs associated?
The taxation is slightly different because we don't have any transfer tax here, so we do pay VAT. The VAT is 10% for off-plan properties, and together with the VAT, we always pay the stamp duty. Our stamp duty is always paid when you buy off-plan is 1.2%. The rest of the expenses are the same, so 1% for the notary and registration fee and 1% for the legal fee. So let's say that when where you pay 9% for resale properties, we should consider like 13.2% for off-plan properties.
And obviously, if they're financing a little bit more,
yeah, a bit more, exactly.
So if a client's financing on an off-plan property or on any kind of property, on a resale property, what sort of role can you play assisting with the mortgage?
Well, the main thing is pushing, the mortgage. Yeah, that's the most important thing. It makes a big difference if the client is qualified and ready to get a mortgage from the beginning, but even before they make the offer, because sometimes the bank will delay the process. It takes time to analyze the financial situation of the client. Then they have the pre-approval, then you need the valuation. And once you get the valuation, you know for sure that you get the money.
But whatever timeline the bank puts on that initially, in my experience, add another 4 to 6 weeks on top.
Yeah, definitely. That's why I say that sometimes if we do a good job with the client and the client has the pre-approval, sometimes, it's easier for the transaction. And we're just basically making arranging the valuation. And once we get the valuation, the bank will give the green light. So that we normally try to get a confirmation before we pay the 10%, so that there is no risk for the client.
So you're spinning a lot of plates, to make sure that this deal happens on time.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a question of being proactive with all the parties involved, and the bank is one of them. Yeah, you know that here we have to push a little bit so that things they move. Yeah, and I think that's the key of everything.
You need a sharp stick maybe to prep them with. Okay, so financing is in place, whether that's a mortgage or they're a cash buyer. Reservation documents signed, the contrato de arras is signed, the next step is completion.
Completion. Yeah.
So what happens with completion date?
Completion is the final step formally for the buyer, is that when we sign the title deed in front of the Spanish notary, this is when you pay the rest of the price and when you get possession of the property, when you get the keys.
And why in front of a notary? What's a notary?
The notary is the public representative that is checking that the transaction is fulfilling the formal requirements. Yeah. So the notary will not do the due diligence of the property, but he will check that, of course, the identity of the parties is correct. The notary will get updated information from the land registry to see that there is no last-minute charge of the property. And of course, they will check that, formally speaking, the transaction is in place. And of course, all the payments have been made according to the regulations.
Okay, so you can't complete unless you have a notary sign.
The notary is necessary, the notary is essential. There is no completion without the notary public.
But what documents are actually signed at completion?
On completion, we sign the title deed. That is the legal document that shows and proves the ownership of a property. This is a document that is signed before the notary public. As we said before, it's a very important figure of our legal system. And it's a long document because in Spain we like the paperwork a lot. So
you sure do.
Where we include the identity of the parties, the representation of the lawyer, if we use power of attorney. So the notary will check that the lawyer has the authority to buy or sell, which is not a minor question. We include the full description of the property, and the notary gets updated information from the land registry, basically to see that there are no last-minute surprises, no charges. And then we include all the information about the breakdown of payments, the price and how we make the payments. Then there are a few requirements that we have to fulfill also when we complete. Basically is that we get from the vendor the community certificate. There is the document to attest that the vendor is up to date with the community fees.
If they're buying in a community.
Of course, if you buy an independent builder with no community, it's not necessary. And also a must for the vendor is providing the energy certificate.
Yeah. I remember when energy certificates came in some years ago, and
it was like 2015.
It was suddenly announced in like April.
Yeah.
And within 2 months they were active, and everyone was panicking. No one knew what these documents were.
Exactly.
But now it's the norm. So obviously, if they're given power of attorney, the buyer or the seller, they don't have to be there. I always say to my clients, look, if you want to go, if you want to be there, and it's an emotional moment for you, by all means come along and we'll come with you. But if you don't have to be there, it's a few hours of your life you're never going to get back. So leave it to the lawyers.
Yeah.
Now, so at the time of signing, the payment goes one way across the table, the keys come the other way. And one thing buyers constantly ask me is, why in Spain do we pay with a banker's draft?
Good question. Yeah, we're still very traditional in our system. Yeah. And we consider the banker's draft as a simultaneous payment. Yeah. And the question is when you make the payment. So if we make transfers, considering that in Spain, the notary does not get any money, as it happens in some European countries, like in the Netherlands. And so if you make the payment before you sign the title deed, the risk is for the buyer. You make the payment after completion, the risk is for the vendor. So the banker's draft is a simultaneous payment, it's liquid money, so it's a way to make sure that everything happens. You get the keys, you get the money.
So it's a guaranteed bank check in the seller's name.
Exactly.
Only the seller can bank it.
Exactly.
And I guess if the buyer's making a bank transfer, they could walk out of transfer and maybe walk out of notary and recall the transfer.
Normally, I mean, every time we use more and more the transfer, it's true, but we use what we call the OMF transfer, this kind of target transfer or immediate transfer that goes through the Bank of Spain, so that we make sure that there is no possibility to, we make sure the money will be
expensive and more complicated.
Well, expensive, more complicated, but it's a standard way to pay, especially when the banks are involved. Especially when getting finance. The bank transfer, the OMF, is a standard payment.
Okay, so it's a Bank of Spain guaranteed transfer.
But we still use the banker's draft a lot.
So a lot of people probably think, that's it, job done. I don't need my lawyer anymore, but
not really. I mean,
not the case. Well, what happens immediately after completion?
In the practice, you get the keys, you access the property, you get possession, and for you, everything is ready. But from our side, there is something that is really important. After completion, we do pay the taxes. We pay the transfer tax or the stamp duty, depending on the property that you buy. And we also set the utilities. We take over any existing contracts, and we make the registration of the property in the land registry. Technically, this is not affecting the possession, not affecting the buyer. But this final step is the way to close the process. And to make sure that the property is in your name in the land base.
Great, so the buyer can go and enjoy the property, start using it, start renting it. Oh, in fact, that's a point I wanted to ask you. Now, we could probably do a whole nother deep dive on this topic, but let's just try and keep it simple. But what extra things should an investor be aware of if they're looking to buy a property to rent out?
All right, good question, Keith. Good question, difficult question to answer.
As I said, we could do a whole hour and a half on this, but
many changes in the regulations. Just to make it simple, we would say, number one, to understand the municipality where you buy, because there are restrictions from the municipality side. Here, we have, let's say, a fight between the powers of municipalities and the Junta de Andalucía, that is the regional authority. So the first thing is to understand if we have any restrictions from the municipality side. In some municipalities, there are specific requirements, like we have in Fuengirola, where you need an independent access, which is quite difficult.
Which rules out a public
Exactly,
lots.
definitely. In Mijas, at the moment, we have no restrictions. So first thing to consider. Second thing, community decisions and community rules and bylaws of the community. So what we check, if there is any specific prohibition from the community side, the committees in the general meeting, they could go against rentals. Second thing, according to the regulations down in the High Court, we have to see if there is any restriction in the estatutos, in the bylaws of the community against economic activities. And then we also need a specific authorization from the community when you want to rent.
One of the biggest compliance mistakes I see investors make, because at the moment in Mijas, for example, if a community has been giving out tourist licenses, but the property they're buying does not have a tourist license, because the tourist license travels with the property, not with the owner now.
Now, exactly.
But the biggest mistake I see people making is buying a property thinking that in the next AGM, when they apply for their tourist license, it will get approved. Now, number one, more and more people who don't rent their property are voting against it, and I completely understand why. But something I only realised recently is, same goes for people that already have an existing tourist license. They're going to vote against it because they don't want any competition. One thing people often don't think about as well is, once you've bought your property, is it important to have a Spanish will for the assets?
Yeah, definitely. The Spanish will is something that we always recommend to any international client, because it's a simple step. It's a document that we sign personally in front of the notary public.
He's a busy man, this notary.
It's a busy man, definitely. We need the notary for everything we do here, but also because we never think of the future. But setting a will here is quite simple, and you control and you cover any potential issue for your family members in the future. The reason why is because we save a lot of money in terms of documents that we need for the inheritance in your home country, legalization, certificates and everything.
So does it replace that will in the home country?
Not at all. I mean, technically, we only need a will for the Spanish assets, as long as there is no contradiction between the Spanish and the will that you have in your home country. You can keep both of them. Yeah, and technically, according to the European regulations, you can decide if you want the standard situation is that you want the law of your nationality to be applicable to the inheritance, where we consider it in systems like the UK system, where you have a totally free disposal of the assets, signing a will, make the inheritance a very straightforward process.
What happens if you don't have a will and God forbid the pass away?
Well, if you don't have a will, we can proceed with the inheritance, but depending on your country, we use an example, the UK, and then you need the probate or the letter of administration
Which
first.
in the UK alone takes forever and a day.
It takes time, it costs money. We need a lot of translations, and then we have to sign here a notary document just to declare who are the inheritors, and then the title deed. So it makes the process longer and expensive.
Okay, Javier, that's great. You survived the deep dive. Now, before we close, just a bit of fun. Quick fire round, okay?
All right.
Quick questions, one-word answers. And I know if there's one thing lawyers aren't good at, it's giving an answer in one word. Okay, ready?
Ready.
Do you need a lawyer for new builds in Spain?
Yes.
Can foreigners buy property here without being residents?
Absolutely.
Can the whole process be done remotely?
Yes, with the power of attorney.
Okay, I'll let you off. Is a Spanish will necessary?
Recommendable.
What's the one document you should never sign without legal advice?
Anything.
Javier, thank you so much. We've covered an awful lot today. If viewers could just take one thing away from this conversation, what would you like them to remember?
How important is the team when you buy a property in Costa del Sol?
Very, very true.
Yeah,
Very true.
That's the most important thing. Good agent, a good lawyer, something that is protecting your interests. That's the key of everything.
Javier, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your time, been really useful. And of course, thank you for watching. I hope you found this episode useful. If you want to get in touch with Javier and his team, all of their details will be in the description of this video. If you found this useful or you have any questions about buying in Spain, drop us a question in the comments. We'll get straight back to you. I'm Keith from Target Property Spain, and we will see you in the next one.